Good afternoon. Welcome back to the afternoon edition of the BNH Virtual Event Space. Jess Santos, aka Miss Jess Best, joining us. And today, Jess, we're talking processing, right?
Mm-hmm. My favorite part.
Your favorite part.
Yeah.
What? So not getting sleep and staying out there for hours to maybe take like two pictures is not
That's
fun.
that's fun and all, but I like the magic of it coming together and like coming into the vision I had in my head. So
I totally get that. Well, I know Jess has an action-packed hour for you all. So again, we're talking about processing, how to bring your images to life. So maybe you want to add a certain flair. Maybe you kind of didn't get the results you wanted in camera and you got to spice it up a little bit. That's what we're talking about. We are encouraging you to get your questions in. So keep the questions coming. I want to send a special welcome to everybody joining us on YouTube Live as well as Facebook and live stream. Drop your questions into the comment section there and we will make sure that Jess gets them answered. And a huge thank you to our sponsor, Sony, for today's event. But Jess, I know you got a lot planned. Take it away.
hi guys, I'm super excited to show you my editing process today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can dive right in right here. And we'll select our photo. So we're going to start in Lightroom and we're going to be working on this image that I took in Glacier last year. This is the raw of the foreground. So as you can tell, there's no clouds in the sky. There's not a lot of light, not a lot of dimension. So I thought this would be the perfect image to bring to life. I'm going to jump back to the edited one really fast. I do want to point out a couple of things when you're in the field. So I know we're talking about processing, but there's some things that have to happen in field to bring the image to life. In this case, I was shooting with a wide angle lens. I was shooting with the Sony 12-24, and I believe I was at 13 millimeters. And I really wanted to use the wide angle distortion of the lens to bring those flowers out to make them look like they're coming out at us. So instead of dropping my camera down low, it was low, but you don't want to drop it to the floor. You want to raise it up a little bit and tilt down. And that will create on the short edges of your frame. It'll really stretch the mountain peak so it becomes taller and more pointy, as well as the flowers coming at you. So just something in field that helps also bring your photos to life. And then another thing I want to touch on before we dive into the editing is white balance. I can't stress enough how important it is to use an actual white balance when you're in the field, whether this be a warmer or a cooler tone, depending on where you want to go in the digital darkroom. But if you're on auto white balance, I find it's very difficult or it takes much longer to get to the colors you want. And if you choose a specific white balance that you like and you stick with it, you can get there a lot faster. So we're going to dive in. I know I just talked about white balance. I did not do this here. As you can tell, it's very, very blue. I think I originally shot this with Milky Way in mind as a blue hour blend, but because of the light on the peaks, I really, really wanted to do a sunset image. So in Lightroom, I do a lot of global adjustments, and I'm going to start off doing that. And where I put these sliders in Lightroom is almost always the same for every image I do, whether it's blue hour, sunrise, sunset, it doesn't matter. Most of these sliders are going to be in the same positions. The only thing that will change between photos and are unique to specific photos are the white balance, the temp and tint, the exposure, contrast, and the HSL sliders, which we'll get into. So let's get started editing. I chose a very blue tone for this image, but we're going to jump back to white balance at the very end. I like to do these top 4 sliders at the very end because it helps. If I do them before, I'm going to have to come back and change them anyways as I bring more light and contrast and everything into the image. So work smart, not hard. Don't have to double do them. So we're going to start with the highlights. And again, this is going to be the same for almost all my images. I'm going to start by pushing the highlights down to the left about -50. Doesn't have to be exact, somewhere in that range. And the shadows up about +50. This gives us a nice neutral kind of contrast-free image. We're making sure we're not losing any detail in our shadows or blowing out our highlights. This helps kind of give us a neutral base to start with. Now, if I move on to the whites and the blacks, if I hold down my Option key or Alt for my PC users, I'm going to move this slider to the right. And you see this color start to appear. That's Lightroom telling you that your highlights are blown out. So we want to back it off. You can also see in the histogram up there. I don't really use that as much, but you can tell that as well. So we back it off to where there's no color there anymore. We're going to do the same thing with the blacks, holding down our Alt, but this time moving it to the left. That color tells us we're losing detail in our shadows. So we're going to back it off until we see no color. And since I generally underexpose my images in the field, this usually ends in a positive number. So in this case, plus 26. Moving on, we jump to the texture, clarity, and dehaze. So texture and dehaze, I don't generally use unless there's some specific purpose to it. Say I have fog in front of my mountains that I kind of want to get rid of, or smoke, or any sort of haze, then I can use the dehaze slider, but I generally use a gradient or radial filter to get rid of that specifically. So we're not going to touch these two sliders. We're only going to touch the clarity. And from this point on, we're only moving the sliders in minimal increments. So subtlety is key here. We don't want to go overboard. It's easier to build than it is to take away. So usually I don't move them past 20. So it's anywhere from 10 to 20 on this. So clarity, I just popped it up to 13. Then vibrance and saturation. There's a difference between these. Vibrance will boost the colors that are most prominent in the image. In this case, the greens and hopefully the pinks. Saturation will boost all the colors in the image. I don't generally use saturation. If I do, it's when I post it to Instagram. I do it on my phone quickly, but in here, I really only touch the vibrance slider. So I'm going to pop that up about plus 13 again. And the reason I don't use the saturation is because when I get down to the HSL sliders, I can actually boost specific colors in that panel versus boosting all the colors. So I want to have more control over it. Jumping down, and I'm just working my way down here so it becomes very redundant. I have the tone curve and I want to create a slight S curve, and I can do that by dragging anchor points up here. I find it's much easier to just pop the lights up about 10 and pop the darks down negative about 10. Again, doesn't have to be exact. That's just around the area that I want to go. And you can see this slight S curve start to form. That gives me a little bit of contrast without going overboard. I can adjust to add more contrast when I jump back up to the top. Generally, I don't. It's only if an image needs it. This is usually where I add my contrast. We're going to come back to these HSL sliders, and I'm going to explain them and walk through them more specifically once we do the overall white balance change. So we'll come back to that in a second. We're not going to use color grading. Now in detail. So I was shooting wildflowers. I was focus stacking wildflowers, and any slight breeze will shift these very, very much so. So instead of using, I use the lowest white balance, or sorry, ISO I could, which was 1000 in this case because the flowers were moving. I would have much preferred to go 100 ISO, but that would have given me too much movement and my shutter speed would have been a lot slower. So you will notice some noise here. We're going to first do the sharpening and then we'll take care of the noise reduction. So with sharpening, I usually go about halfway. Now it's very important to note this bottom slider here that says masking. So with masks, white reveals and black conceals. So if I hold down my Option key or Alt for PC and start to move this slider, the very beginning, everything's white. That means everything's being sharpened. I don't want that to be the case. Sharpening in shadows adds noise. So we want to, and in the sky as well, even though we're not going to use this sky. I want to move this, and it's generally anywhere for me from 70 to 90. And I just want the edges of the flowers and the edges of the mountains to be sharpened. I don't want any of the shadows. And as you can see, I have a lot of shadow in the front right, and we're going to fix that later with a local adjustment. But for now, I just kind of want it about there. So we're at 80 right now. So you can see just the edges of the flowers, those rocks down there, the edges of the mountains are sharpened, and no sharpening in the sky or the shadows. So only where there's white is going to be sharpened, and gray, anything 50% gray or brighter. White being the most sharpened, gray being less sharpened, but still sharpened. So there we go. Can I say sharpen more times? So as you can see, if I just had this down here, do you see how much noise is now in my leaves? I don't want that. So when I mask it back to the 80, which we settled on, now in the shadows, there's less noise, but it's still being sharpened. You can see some movement because can't be perfect all the time. I got some movement in my flowers. I'm not too concerned about it, but so the luminance, I'm going to pop my luminance up a little bit. This will further help get rid of the noise. But if I move it too far, as you can see, it looks like an oil painting. We don't want that. So we're going to move it no more than 20, but it's usually less than 10 for me. Make sure I'm all the way right there. Okay. So moving on, this down here, this color noise reduction, if you have hot pixels. So hot pixels are usually a result of long exposure where your sensor gets hot, and they're like red and green and sometimes blue pixels. This color noise can help you get rid of that. In this case, I was using as fast of a shutter as I could, so I don't have that problem, but I just wanted to point that out in case you have a long exposure or something that has that issue. In my lens corrections, so this is very, very important. Well, not this part. Remove chromatic aberration. It usually happens along where the horizon meets the sky. Doesn't do much, but it doesn't hurt. So I always check it, but I never, ever, ever check enable profile corrections unless there's a person in the scene. And this is because, as I said earlier, I'm using the lens distortion to really make those flowers look like they're coming at you, as well as the peak more pointy. So if I were to click enable profile corrections, it would just get rid of all that hard work I did in the field, and I don't want that, so I won't click it. There might be cases where you're using a wide angle lens and you have really straight lines, such as in architectural photography or something with a person in it, and they just look odd. That would be a case where you would want to use that. In this case, we don't want to use that. Transform, we don't need to do anything here. Effects, I usually add a vignette, but I'm going to add it at the very end. If I added it now, when I've replaced the sky won't have the vignette, and the foreground which will look very strange. So we're going to keep that as is for now. And then at the very bottom here, under the blue primary, under the saturation slider, I like to push this like 2 to 5, and that just boosts the blues in our color calibration. I just like the look of it. It's optional, but be careful here. This is one of those things that can go super bad, super quick. So very, very little here. So now I've done all those sliders, and I could essentially mostly make a preset out of the sliders because I do the same thing to every single photo. But so again, whether I'm doing sunset, sunrise, blue hour, it doesn't matter. It's always the same. So this is where the magic comes in, and it's specifically for this photo. So in this case, I'm looking at the temp and the tint slider. The temp is going to give me blue or yellow tones. And as you can see, it's very, very blue. So I'm just going to bump the temp a little bit to the right, just to give a little bit of yellow tones. I don't want to go too far because, as you can see, what happens with these leaves is not very pleasant. So I want to be very careful on how far I go, especially when I have green and a lot of green in the image. The tint slider is the more important white balance slider, and a lot of my clients forget the tint slider. It's the most important white balance slider in my opinion, because we're looking at blue tones and yellow tones specifically to tell where our tint should be. And I know that sounds counterintuitive because we have the temp slider for that, but this really creates the tone range that you want to work in. So I'm looking for specifically a rich royal blue in this case, and I say this a lot in my blue hour as well. I'm looking at the sky here. Since we have a bluebird sky, I want to get this sky to kind of a rich royal blue. Right now it's looking more on the cyan to me, and this will come with practice and just seeing a lot of different colors to be able to pick out where this tint slider should go. So overall, it's looking very, very green. I know personally that the sky I'm going to be using is a pink sky to kind of match with these flowers. So I want to bring it to the pink tones. And I don't want to bring it too far because we don't want it to look crazy purple. We'll bring it to about here. So that way we have these pink tones coming back in, and you can see this blue very barely because it's kind of washed out. We can bring that back a little bit. Let's lower our exposure a tiny bit. So you can see now it's kind of a rich royal blue, like a blue jean color is the best I can describe it. That's what we're going for. So now we've done all the global adjustments. Let's work on some color adjustments to really make these pink flowers pop, as well as these glow on this mountain from the fading light of the sun. Before I do that, I have to crop this because it's driving me crazy. I'm using this peak to determine where I should rotate it. Vertical lines or horizontal lines are the easiest to determine if you're like a little off kilter. Sometimes the level on your camera will be green and you're like good to go, and then you get it back and it's a little off. So using vertical lines, I'm just looking at this peak and I want to get that as straight up and down as possible. I also want to push it up and leave a little bit because I can crop out these leaves. They're not helping my composition, but I don't want to lose the sky. So I'm going to push it up a little bit. Okay. So let's jump down to these HSL sliders. So HSL stands for hue, saturation, and luminance. We're going to start with the hue slider. And this is where you can make different colors more one way or the other in terms of hue goes. Specifically here, we're looking at the pinks, the greens, and with that comes red and orange because pink tones are made up of those colors as well. So it's important to keep in mind what colors make up other colors because sometimes the hue will affect that. If you're having trouble, you can click this little circle here and you can hover over what you want to change and go up or down. And you can see here that the red and the magenta are changing. I like to have more control, so I don't use this, but if you're having trouble and you're new to HSL sliders, that's an easy way to figure out what's happening or what colors you should be changing. So in this case, I want my magenta. So I know my sky has a little more orange tones in it. So normally I would push the magenta towards the purple a little bit, and I like that sort of pink. But in this case, I want to better match the clouds that I'm going to drop in. So I'm going to actually push the magenta a little towards the red. And in turn, because the red was moving, I'm going to move the red a little towards the pink. I don't want it to get too orange. I just want it to be a nice, like, bright, hot pink versus a fuchsia or something like that. Something around there. And then something I always like to do when there's green in the photos, green foliage, green trees, grass, something like that, I like to push this green hue slider towards the right a little bit. That makes the greens a little more blue and more luscious. If I were to push it to the left, you can see how dead they look. So we want them to look alive and thriving. So we're going to just push it slightly towards the blue. We don't want to go too crazy because that's unnatural. We just want to just a tiny bit, like 10 or 15 or so. With the yellow, I'm actually going to push it to the orange a little bit. There's not a lot of change happening here, but I'm trying to get this color up here a little more orange. And in turn, same with the orange slider, I'm going to push it to, you can see how that mountain, especially up here, changes quite rapidly. So I'm just going to push it a little bit towards the orange so we get that nice alpenglow look versus like a yellowy green color. So with the hue, we're just making a little bit of adjustments. We kind of did all the colors except blue, but we're adjusting them separately versus using white balance and changing it all together. So it's really, really helpful to change hues in here. Then we jump to the saturation. There we go. So we jump to the saturation, and in this particular image, I know I want to boost the pinks because these flowers, right? And I want to boost the red because again, they're part of the flower. I want to boost the orange because of these orange peaks up here. And I actually want to desaturate the green just slightly because the green is really overpowering in this image. And I'd rather the green go back in saturation and the pink come forward. So we're isolating those flowers and bringing them out towards us. So we're using color to create that dimension in the photo. So taking the greens back a little bit because our eye is naturally drawn to things that are brighter, warmer, and more saturated. So desaturating that a little bit. I'm also going to desaturate the blue and the purple just a tiny bit because there's a lot of blue and purple in this mountain. And since this is supposed to be a sunset shot, I don't really want that. So again, very, very minute. And then we can move on to luminance. So luminance is going to either brighten or darken certain color tones depending on which slider you use. In this case, we want to brighten those flowers again. So we're going to bring those flowers so they're more looking like they're coming at us. So we're going to use the magenta and bring that up. So we can watch, if we bring it up all the way, you can see, here, I'll zoom in, not 200. Let's zoom out here to 100. There we go. So we can see this flower. If I bring it, you can see what's happening in the color here. So we want to really make these flowers pop. So I'm actually going to push that quite a bit because I'm not having any weird artifacting. I'm okay with doing that. You want to be sometimes careful with these HSL sliders because you can have some strange things going on. I'm also going to check with the purple because it seems like there's some purple tones down here. And I was correct. So I'm going to move that up as well. Again, brightening these flowers. And then the red tones would be the top of the flowers. So we're going to brighten that up. Any orange tones? No. Okay. So now these flowers are getting this three-dimensional quality because we brighten them. I want to kind of darken where the sun is falling on these mountains to give it a much richer tone. So if I move this down, I don't want to go too far because now it looks like a muddy mess. So this is what I was saying about sometimes strange things can happen if you move these sliders too much. So I'm just going to move it down like -25. And that looks good. Same with here. So it's affecting these areas mostly. Now the greens, I can move them down or I can move them up. I'm not going to move them up. I'm going to move them slightly down. Again, trying to bring those flowers out from the leaves. So now we've pretty much done most of our, I'm just going to pop a little tiny bit of contrast in here. Most of our global adjustments in Lightroom. I'm going to hop over to Photoshop and then we can add the sky in as well as do some more local adjustments, specifically with dodging that'll create some dimension. So when I go from Lightroom to Photoshop, I want to right click my image, edit in, open as smart object in Photoshop. And this is very important and I'll show you why as soon as it opens. Give it a second. There we go. Okay. So, oops. Nope, we don't want to do that. There we go. So the reason I want to open this as a smart object, you can see this little square down here in the bottom. If I double click this, it opens Adobe Camera Raw. And all the adjustments that I made in Lightroom are here. And this is especially important when you're doing things with like adding in skies, because you might have to go back and do some color matching between the sky and the foreground. And so I want to have all these adjustments here so I don't have to kind of start from scratch or do a lot of backtracking to get there. So yes, let's do that. Okay. So I also want to open my sky. And this sky was shot in Montana as well. It was just shot 3 days prior. I'm going to open this in Photoshop as a smart object. Even though I've done no editing changes to it, it'll be easier in the long run for me.
Just quick question while you're pulling
Mhm.
that up. In
Yep.
regards to skies, since Photoshop introduced that feature, do
Yes.
you shoot skies particularly to stamp into to other images, or is it just something kind of like you go through and see what you have available?
So I've always shot skies every time I get clouds, which is very few and far between. I have what I call a sky bank, and they're all my own sky shots. And I've always shot them because I will say I probably get less than 10 days of good sunsets or sunrises in the year. It's like the universe telling me to have clear skies and do astrophotography only. So when I get some clouds, I'm like, bam, 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 every focal length, every angle I can imagine. I have like 50 shots of those skies. And then sometimes like images, especially like this one worked out that I shot a sky that would work for the image relatively closely. But sometimes like I have a really great sky that I'm waiting for the right foreground, or I have a really great foreground that I'm waiting for the right sky. So I have it built up. I actually don't use the Photoshop sky replacement. I'm like old school. I like my way and I'm going to do it my way. But I
Oh,
hear
nice. All
really
right.
great things about it.
Good. You're gonna drop something on us. All right. I like
Yeah.
that. I like old
So
school.
I'm going to show you how to do it the old school way, because sometimes Photoshop doesn't work the way you want it to, and you'll end up not being able to replace your sky because you can't get it to work. So this is like the old school way and
Awesome.
how it was done before fancy things like sky replacement.
Perfect. We are all eyes.
Okay, so we're going to go back. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to drop in the sky here. So to do that, I'm going to go over to my channels. We're going to use what's called luminosity masking. And this is the same technique for my blue hours and Milky Ways. It sometimes gets a little more complicated, but I wanted to actually, let me backtrack for a second. Before we talk about that, let's talk about choosing the right sky. So it's very, very important. First and foremost, if we go back to our actual image here, we can see that this was a sunset shot and the light is coming from the right-hand side of the frame, shining towards the left. So it's this nice soft side light. So when choosing a sky, we can see the light is actually coming from the right-hand side of the frame because these clouds are lit up like that. So that's very, very number one. When you're choosing a sky, you want the light to be coming from the same direction as it is in your foreground. Second thing is color theory. So we have these pink flowers here. I wouldn't want to drop in a yellow or an orange sky into this because it just wouldn't look right. And if I were to get clouds, as clouds naturally happen and progress during sunset, they start by turning golden yellow, and then they go into oranges, and then they go into pinks, and eventually like a pink purpley color, which is what I have here. And so if I had clouds here, I would have waited until they were in that pink purple color to better match the colors in my foreground. And this is like color theory throughout your image. A lot of times we think nature just gives us what it gives us, but it's really important to wait for the right timing and the right light and the right colors for it to all come together, or replace the sky with the correct color sky. If I had yellow flowers in the foreground, you better believe I would be using that golden orange sunset to really bring that out. So just think about color theory in that respect. As far as replacing skies, it'll make it look much more natural. And then finally, for me, foreground is the most important. This image is more important than the sky. The sky should be a supporting role to your foreground. It shouldn't take center stage, although some skies can be fiery and they go really well in certain foregrounds. In this case, I have a lot going on down here, a lot of texture, a lot of flowers, like it's just all going on down here. If I put a really, really textured sky up there, it would just like be competing for your attention. I want your attention to start here, go through this valley and up into the sky at the very last. So just keep that in mind when you're choosing a sky. So let's jump back. We're going to replace this sky. So we're in our channels. We're going to click on the red, the green, and the blue. And what we're looking for here is the most contrast between the sky and the foreground. So we want the sky here to be as white as possible and the foreground to be as black as possible. or at least have the same tonal values. So I'm going to go with the blue channel. So I think that's the best. You could go blue or green here. It doesn't really matter. I mean, either way. Let's go with green actually. So let's command click or control click if you're using a PC on that. And we need to create a new alpha channel, which is this rectangle with a circle in it right here. So we have this new alpha channel and we want to work on this new alpha channel. If you're doing this and you find that you go back to your layers and your image is all sorts of weird colors, it's because you forgot this step. So very, very important step. Then we're going to Command D or Control D to deselect, and we're going to further the contrast here. So you can either go Command L for levels, or it's image adjustments levels. Now I have this pulled up, and this little white arrow and this little black arrow, they want to come together and they want to be friends, but they don't want to come too close because you'll end up with strange artifacting. So you want to keep that in mind. And we really don't need to move this gray one. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't. In this case, it's not really helping. So I'm just gonna back that off. Okay, I'm gonna click OK. Now in this image, I have trees. So a quick way to mask out those trees. And I would probably actually cut these off, and I'm sure I did, and just exclude them from the mask. But just for the sake of illustration, if we go to our paintbrush here and we have it on black and we change the mode to overlay, and let me just, yeah, 100%. Sorry, I assumed things in the way. Okay, 100%. And then if we paint on our channel, anything that is 50% gray or darker will be painted black, while anything 50% gray or brighter will be left alone. So this is a really good way to clean up your horizon line. There we go. And in this case, because I have these trees, I'm going to have a complete black and white mask normally. And for time's sake, I would just use the quick selection tool here and go like that. And bam, I have my sky selected. However, since these trees are in the way, you can see that I don't have a selection in between the branches. So to make this as quick and painless, and I would spend more time on this if I had it, but we're gonna make it quick. So I changed the brush back to black, is black 100% normal, and I'm gonna paint in this whole foreground here. And I'm actually gonna make the brush hardness 100%. Don't go near the horizon. You don't want to paint in the horizon. That's what the overlay brush helped with. We're going to zoom in, make sure we get these white patches of snow. Excuse my dog barking if you can hear him. Okay. And I would spend much more time on this mask, but oops, for time's sake, I'm just going to rush through it quickly so we can get to the final product. Here we go. And so I want to make sure that this foreground is all painted black. Clean up these little areas and these little areas, and looks like we're pretty good. Okay. So now all I have to do here is Command or Control click this alpha channel, and it selects my sky. And this time you'll notice that in between all these branches was selected as well. I would end up just painting those out of the end mask because they're just little fine and they're distracting. But for demonstration's sake. Okay, so now once we have the sky selected, we're gonna go and we want to expand that selection a tiny bit because otherwise we'll end up with a strange blue line along our horizon. So select, modify, expand, and we're gonna do this by 2 pixels. Click OK and select modify feather because we don't want a very harsh line. We're going to do this by 1 pixel only and click OK. Then we're going to jump back over to our layer here and holding down Option key so it'll apply the inverse of the mask. We're going to hold down Option or Alt for PC and click this little rectangle with the circle. Nope, sorry. Oh my gosh. Hold down the Option key. There we go. I wasn't pressing it hard enough. Okay, so now we have our sky cut out. We're going to go over to our sky that we're going to use. We're going to right click and click duplicate layer and drop it into this image, which is what we just cut out. And then we can close this. Don't need to save it because we haven't done anything, and drop our sky behind. So now I'm going to move the sky into place. I believe on the final image, this might not be exact as my previous final edit, but it's somewhere around here because I liked these like somewhat lenticular clouds, but I didn't want them to be too small. So somewhere around there, that works. We're going to apply that. Now we want to edit this sky because it's unedited. So if we double click here on our little square, we didn't do anything in Lightroom, but if we had done stuff in Lightroom, it would be right here. I'm going to just adjust this a little bit. I want to be able to see my foreground slightly, so I make sure I'm getting kind of the same like colors going on. There we go. So I already know that I want to take the sky and make it more pink to better match the foreground. So we're going to do that first and foremost. We don't want to go too crazy because then you get purple up here. But since we're just using this section, this blue is still pretty good. So we're going to bump it that way. We're also going to take down the highlights and push up the shadows a little bit. And then we don't need to worry about the whites or the blacks or anything like that. Let's jump to this vibrance here, pump that up a little bit. And then in the curves, you'll notice some very similar patterns going on. We're going to create that little bit of S curve, +10, -10 roughly. We don't need to do any sharpening here. There is some sharpening that Lightroom or Photoshop imports. So we're just going to do our mask and make sure it's just on the edges of those clouds and not in the sky. Then we can add a little bit of noise reduction. And most importantly is our color mixer. So we want to go to our hues and we want our reds to be more pink, our oranges to be more red, and our magentas to be more towards the purple to better match these flowers that we got going on. So we're not going to get there perfect because it's just different colors, but we want to kind of get in the same vicinity. And then if we jump over to the saturation, I'm just going to desaturate the aqua and the blue a little bit to kind of lighten up this area. And then in the luminance, let's bring down these oranges to make them a little more rich, and the reds. And then I'm going to jump back to the hue and push these a little bit more and take them down a little bit in the saturation. So now we end up with something that's kind of like pinky purple going on, and hopefully it will match our flowers as closely as possible. So we're going to click OK. And wait for it to do its thing. There we go. So now we have a much more even color balance going on between the sky and the foreground. So there's a very important step now. After we put in the sky, we've kind of matched those colors. I'm feeling like I need to go a little bit more pink in the foreground. So I'm going to double click that, go up to my basic and push this a little bit more. And I want to take it a little more on the blue to take out the yellow. So we have more purpley tones in these mountains. So that's why it's important to have smart objects, because you can go in and make those minor changes as you're blending the sky. So now it looks much more cohesive. We kind of have these purple tones matching. We kind of have these pink tones matching here. But what I like to do before we move on to the next step is just add a gradient layer sandwiched in between. So this is going to be behind our foreground and above our sky. And it's going to serve as like glow or just natural haze that happens on the horizon. And this helps the blend look more believable. So in this case, I'm going to do a linear gradient. So it's up here. And if your Photoshop is not set up already, you want to click this down arrow. It's usually on this one to begin with, but we want to make sure it goes from color to transparent. And then we're going to drop down here to our color and click somewhere along the horizon somewhere as close to the horizon line as possible. And we in this case end up with this kind of coral color. I want it to be more pink, so I'm just going to change it. And we're going to move this up because we want it to be not so dark. And then we don't want it to be super saturated. So something like this kind of matches our horizon line. Click OK. And then we're on our gradient tool. We're on a layer that we just created. And we're going to go from about halfway up the image, hold down the shift key so it's a straight line, and just push that up. It didn't show so much, so we're going to actually adjust this using the move tool up here. And we're going to make that gradient more or less, sorry, less soft. There, something like that. Now, once you got it about where you want it, I like to change the blend mode to soft light, and then you can lower the opacity to where you see fit. In this case, and in usually all my photos, I like it a lot more, but some people look at it and they feel like it's a little artificial, so they want to lower the opacity a little bit. So I'm going to leave it like that. Now, in this particular image, I know for a fact that I created 2 gradient layers, so I'm going to do that here. And this second gradient layer, I'm actually going to bring a little more saturation to it. And I'm going to use my gradient tool again. And again, holding down shift, moving up. And I'm going to adjust that also. But I don't want it to go up as high as the lighter pink. And so that should be okay. And I'm going to change that to soft light as well and lower the opacity on it quite a bit. So as you can see, if I click on and off these, it just creates kind of a glow, and it creates that separation from the foreground and the sky. So it gives a little more dimension there. Now, for time's sake, I'm not going to do this, but I would normally play with these colors a little bit more just to get them to match. If I jump over to this one and my actual edited one, I can see that I did a color balance here. Let's turn off this one's, turn you off. There you go. I did a color balance here. So you can see it's a little more blue here, and I had a little more yellow tones. So play with the colors, try and get them to match as much as possible. In this case, I would probably go, and it's going to drive me crazy, so I'm going to do it anyways. I'm going to go and make it a little more towards the yellow and not so much. And then actually add a gradient, because when I move it towards the yellow, these leaves become dead looking. So I'm going to actually create a gradient layer and bring those back down blue. Click OK. And wait. There we go. That already matches much better. I'm a little bit happier with that. So I'd like to move on, because the most important step is next. We got our clouds in, we got our foreground, kind of the right color balance. So what I'm going to do here is create a stamped visible layer. And I like to say that's all the buttons plus E. So Command Shift Option E, or Control Alt Shift E for PC. So this just creates a flattened layer for us to work with while still keeping all our layers down here in case we need to go back and make any changes. But what I want to talk to you guys about right now is my favorite part, dodging. Well, dodging and burning, but we're not going to do any burning. We just do dodging. And this is where I spend the most time on an image. And this is really what gives it the dimensional quality. So to start with, I don't use the dodge or the burn tool, because I find that the dodge tool adds saturation and the burn tool muddies up the shadows. So instead of doing that, we're going to use luminosity to create our dodge layer, or to direct our dodge layer. So the first step is to duplicate this stamped visible layer. And then we want to make this duplicated layer as bright, or much brighter than we think it should be. And this will serve as our dodge layer. So to do that, I press Command L or Control L, or Image Adjustments Levels. And this little white arrow, I usually move in to about like kind of where this histogram falls off. Sometimes more, sometimes less. I think right about here because I'm not paying attention to the sky. And more importantly, I want to create dimension down here in the flowers because this mountain is really dimensional already. I'll just paint that out in the mask, but I'm looking down here more. So I want to go a little bit brighter. There we go. So use your judgment there, but this is going to serve as our dodge layer and it's a brighter exposure than our layer beneath, right? So we're going to jump back into our channels. This is where the luminosity masking part comes in. And we're going to click on the red, the green, and the blue again. But this time we're looking for the most contrast between where the light is naturally falling and where the shadows naturally are. So we want that where the light is falling to be as white as possible and where the shadows are to be as black as possible to really isolate those natural highlights in the image. So as I click through here, definitely not green because you can notice all these are the same tonal value. Blue, we have really bright flowers and looking at the mountain looks good. And then the red, let's see. I'm going to mask out the clouds anyway, so I'm going to go with the blue because they're going to be darker and that's good. Okay, so we're going to command click again. We need to make that new alpha channel, otherwise our image will end up with weird colors. So we're going to click here and go down to our new alpha channel and command or control D to deselect. We want to create further contrast the same way we did with the sky. So command or control L or image adjustments levels. I use it a lot. And we're going to bring this white arrow and this black arrow close together. They want to be friends, just like before. So you can see where the highlights naturally are, where the light is naturally hitting becomes more and more white as I move that white arrow in, and where the shadows are becomes more and more black. And that's exactly what we want. So we're going to click OK and then command click our alpha channel to make a selection. Jump back over to our layers and add the layer mask here. So immediately ignore the sky because we're going to paint it out, but look at the flowers in the foreground. Do you see how much dimension that already created? Now we can go in and further this. So this part I like to call creating my little finger painting, and the mask will look like a finger painting at the end, but it really, really adds dimension. And if you want to spend any amount of time in the digital darkroom, this would be the most important place to do so. So click your little paintbrush. Now remember with masks, white reveals and black conceals. So we're going to start off with black at 100%. We want to use a very soft brush. And the reason I have 100% is because I want to paint out the sky and the mountain completely. So I'm going to make a nice big brush and do a little swoop down so that that is not included in the mask. And you can see it got blacked out here. I also don't want to include this gravel riverbed. Well, I guess it's a riverbed, dry riverbed in it. I'm not worried about this because later I would clone stamp it out, so I'm not so concerned. And this rock right here in the middle of my flowers. Okay, so once I've taken out the parts I don't want dodged or highlighted or brightened, I'm going to switch over to white and I'm going to change my opacity. Let me just move this down to 25%. 25. There we go. Okay. It's always easier to paint more than to take away. So I would zoom in and I'm going to go around with my white brush, make it small, still big enough, and just paint in where I want that light, where the light is naturally falling. Please note that I am not adding any light. I am only enhancing what light is already there. So I'm going to paint around these flowers because I really want the flowers to pop out. So I want to make sure I hit every flower, and I would spend a lot more time doing this. And then also here in the mountain, not where the sun is because I don't want that to get too blown out, but like this rock face, I can brighten up, and I can brighten up this ridge that it's hitting. I can also brighten up these trees. And what I'm doing is just really creating a visual path that starts from the flowers and leads you all the way in. kind of like a little S curve going on here. So I'm not going to paint any light over here because I want your eye to go this way. So even though this might be in sun, I don't want to enhance that. I just want to enhance where I want to lead the viewer through the frame. So especially this ridge and this light here. There we go. Oops, not that last part. Okay. So I could honestly spend hours doing that. I don't have time here to spend hours doing that, but I cannot stress the importance of using this technique to create that dimension. Oftentimes I get asked, are my images so sharp? It has nothing to do with sharpness and everything to do with creating dimension in this way. I don't do any other sharpening than what I've already shown you in Lightroom. So keep that in mind. This will really give a 3D effect. Also, along my visual path, even though we were talking about the leaves and making them kind of sink into the background, along my visual path, I can just highlight those leaves in the specific areas that I want the viewer to see. So I don't want to highlight the leaves down here because I don't want the viewer to look there. I want the viewer to come in from this side and move through the frame. So again, I could spend hours doing this. I'm not going to do that. I want to show you guys one more thing because I'm running out of time. One more thing to really kind of add that dimensional quality to. And a lot of you might know it already if you've gotten into editing heavily. It's called the Orton glow. And there are many, 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 many ways to do this. I'm going to show you my favorite that I've found. But there's tons of ways to do it. Also, so the Orton glow, for those of you who don't know, it kind of creates a dream-like quality to your image. So it adds kind of a blur or a glow feel, really wrapping the light around the highlighted areas of the image. So very easy to do. To do that, I'm going to create a stamped visible layer. Again, Command Shift Option E or Control Alt Shift E for PC. All the buttons plus E. Again, creating that flatten layer to work from, but still keeping my layers down here. I'm going to duplicate this layer and I'm going to blur that layer. So filter, blur, Gaussian blur. And so this radius here is going to depend on the megapixels of the camera you're using. In this case, I shot this with the Sony a7R4, 61 megapixels. I'm going to type in 61 there and click OK. Then I'm going to hop back over to my channels again because we're going to use a luminosity mask to find our highlights. This case, we don't need to be as specific as we did with the dodge layer. All we need to do here is command click the RGB layer. And what this does is select anything 50% gray or brighter in tonal value as a selection. So in this case, you can kind of see the sky mostly. So I'm going to jump back to these layers. And I'm going to apply that as a mask. So it's still too blurry at this point. We're going to change this blending mode of our blurred layer to soft light, my favorite. And if I click on and off here, you can kind of see what it's done, especially this light in this mountains just really makes it really beautiful, and richer tones in the flowers as well, where we highlighted. Now, last thing, you can leave it here. I personally don't like the contrast to be so much like it is here. So I like to create a curves adjustment layer. I find about 50% of my clients love it the way a more matted look where we lift the shadows, and 50% love the more contrasted look, which is here. I personally like a more matte film look. So I'm going to use an adjustment layer, completely optional, curves in the RGB channel. Instead of just lifting this to lift the shadows, I'm going to be more accurate and click that arrow. And in the output, I put anywhere from 2 to 4. In this case, I'll put 3, enter. And then I like to add a little blue tones to my shadows because, again, the eye is drawn to warm, bright, saturated colors. So by adding blue tones to my shadows, it kind of recedes them and the brighter, warmer tones come out. So again, instead of lifting this up, I'm just going to click that there. And my magic number for this is 2. So you can click on and off And you can kind of see what that did for it. Now, if you don't like this, or you only like it in a certain area, you can actually paint with black on this mask here, because it's a white mask. So everything's being revealed on this adjustment layer, but you can actually paint in black. So say I didn't want it in the leaves in the foreground, I can make my brush hard, a little bit more hard, not completely, and turn my opacity to 100. I'm going to do a nice big brush, and this is just for demonstration purposes, but I can paint it out. Say I didn't want it there, or say I didn't want it here. Like you can see that it's disappearing wherever I paint with black. So that's the Orton Glow and the curves adjustment layer. I hope you guys, I know it's a lot of information, but we can jump to Q&A right now if we want, if we have any questions. Sorry,
yeah.
I threw it all at you. I like to give you guys all
No.
the information I have.
No, that's the best thing to do. I mean, is just to get it out there. And it's great to watch other people edit. I hate editing. It's like the bane of my existence, but
Oh, I
it's
love
actually
it.
kind of relaxing watching it come to life when I don't have to do the work myself.
Yeah.
I mean, I got to start with how much, if you're not teaching a workshop, you're not doing it live. I'm gonna turn my camera on here so it's not like you're talking to a screen. How long do you normally take? Like an average image?
So for me, if it's just a sunset or sunrise, when I say just a, but like a sunset or sunrise would probably take like an hour, 2 hours max. Night images can take a little bit longer. There's a lot more color finessing that has to happen. But yeah, sometimes it's as fast as 30 minutes. It depends on how good I got the sky, how many clouds I got in the sky. Do I have to drop one in or not? So
definitely.
yeah.
And I'll remind people to get your questions in, but I just want to stay right there, Jess, because I think it's always relevant when we do discussions like this. Editing, it's everyone has different tastes. Everybody, sometimes some people are, look, you have your people who are like, get there, get the sunrise, get the sunset, if not, whatever. And then you have people who they want to do more of a fine art look. They want to go for something like this. And I think the benefit of doing something like this is you're showing people what's available out there. Everybody has different styles, different tastes. Some people might take 10% of what you said and apply it to their work in their own way. Some people might take 100% of what you said and apply it to their work in their own way. So I always throw that out there whenever we do post-processing, because it always seems like post-processing is a very polarizing topic, because everybody has different styles. I mean, I know I took a photography course a long time ago, and my teacher was like, your work is too saturated.
Yeah.
You know, your work is too saturated. And it's like now it's like, okay, I want to go back and revisit that class. But again, get your questions in. I just wanted to throw that in there because it's like, I know it's so hard to sit here and post-process live on the internet. And it's like, you feel like you can't.
I'm giving away all my secrets. So you know.
You're giving away your secrets.
You know if it was composited or not.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, and I think there's a beautiful thing about that. It's like we see so much gatekeeping now in locations and, you know, how do you get your certain look? And it's like everything's out there. There's a tutorial on every kind of look, every kind of. So I want to transition it into a question we got in. Do you roll with each image as far as what that image needs? Do you have the Jess Santos look that you know, will you take something and be like, okay, well, it might call for this, but it's not going to fit my what's the word I'm looking for? Curated aesthetic look. Yeah, your aesthetic.
So I naturally started off like really pushing pink and purple tones, and that's kind of stayed with my work because I just personally like that. There's some people that like more cyan tones or more green, or I just personally like the look of the more pink and purple tones. And when I first started out, my images were way too saturated, and some of my night images in particular looked like Barney purple skies. So I've evolved over time, and I'm getting a little more into more pink and blue tones. So like there is some growth that happens, but for the most part, I think it comes down to, I have a background in wedding photo retouching, and you have to have the same style aesthetic throughout the photos when you work with a specific photographer. So for me, when I edit, as I said in the very beginning, like all those adjustments that I do with those sliders are the same on every single photo. And the white balances I use in the field are always the same. So it ends up looking the same aesthetic no matter what. Sometimes I'll throw in a strange, like completely blue or more yellow, but I tend to stay within the realms of the aesthetic I have. And I think it just naturally happens because I like that look. So I make it look like that. But yeah, so
Interesting. I mean, it makes sense. You normally only think of like keeping that same color gradient and aesthetic throughout, like in like commercial where everything has to match. But it's
yeah,
interesting, like with wedding, you're right. It's like you don't want it to look like 5 different photographers shot a wedding. Or
especially if I'm working, like I don't personally shoot weddings. I've never shot weddings, but I've retouched. I worked as a retoucher for like 10 years now. So like I'm really used to having to be in that aesthetic. And so I think that comes out in my own work as well. I like to create a regimented workflow so I know where I'm going. Whereas some of my friends or fellow photographers choose to approach each image as an individual piece, an individual artwork. I kind of tend to approach each image the same and then make minor adjustments as needed. So just a
okay,
different way of editing.
definitely. Now we had a question come in regarding for beginners, for somebody who doesn't have their editing chops yet or might not have their style down.
Mhm.
What is the most overlooked editing feature or tool that you don't see people making use of like they should be?
The tint slider. The tint slider is so important for your white balance. And I find that, like, I was just at a workshop or a couple workshops, and in every workshop, I'm like, we're going to use the tint slider. And they're like, oh, you use the tint slider?
What?
I was
Everyone's like
like,
blue and yellow, and they forget
yeah,
about
blue and yellow,
green
and
and
they
red.
forget about the green and pinks or green and magenta. So
Yeah.
the tint slider, and then oftentimes that I guess I would say probably the masking part of the sharpening, again, is another minute thing, but it's so important because you don't want to make your images noisy. So everyone always goes for contrast and HSL sliders and saturation, and really that tint slider and that sharpening slider is very important in Lightroom for beginners, like when you're getting into the very first starting things. So.
Interesting. You surprised me. I wasn't expecting that. It's just like I mean, I always incorporate it, but I probably wouldn't never think of that to throw that out as like something that can
I
game
run
change.
into so many people who haven't ever touched it. So, and that's usually with beginners. So that's a very overlooked thing for sure.
And I think color in general, number one, I'd venture to say 95% of people who aren't doing photography professionally, so 95% of either beginners, hobbyists, amateurs, aren't calibrating their monitors.
Oh yeah, very
And
important.
it's very important. And you don't realize it's always a good test for color. Like there's times when I look at images and I'm like, what if I'm seeing the colors completely off? Or what if, like, doing color balance exercises or going back and revisiting an image a week after you processed it last gives you like a greater appreciation for when your color balance is off, or
Yeah, just
white
sending it
balance.
to your phone too can tell you that your computer screen isn't like as calibrated as you think it should be, especially I find with brightness, because I edit with my brightness full brightness, but I also calibrate it with it bright. So that when I send it to my phone, it's if you send it to your phone and your phone's brightness is all the way up and it's super dark, like there's something going on with your brightness on your computer screen and how you're editing and how it calibrated. Just getting further into besides just color calibration. And then working in the right color space from camera to editing is like a more advanced thing, but I would encourage people to check out the difference between like Adobe RGB versus sRGB. And I know that sounds really technical if you're a beginner, but it's really important if you're sending your photos out and they look completely different than they do on your computer. It could be your monitor calibration. It could also be the color space you're working in. So
Definitely. And a lot of it depends on the media. If you're printing, it's like a whole different process.
yeah, that's why I
than if you're
encourage
just
you to
showing.
look that up. That's a whole different topic that could take hours to discuss.
What are you doing for the next 3 hours?
Yeah. like
Yeah,
talking
it's
about color spaces and all
uh
that sort of thing. But really encourage you guys to look it up if you're not familiar. So,
yeah, definitely. It's like a rabbit hole you go into when
mhm.
discussing post-processing. You actually stole the next question out of my mouth. I don't
Oh,
know how you
sorry,
saw it
my
coming. No,
bad.
about no, it's about because we had a question come in about the brightness, what brightness of your screen. There's
Yeah.
like different schools of thought. There's some people that are like full brightness if I'm just showing it on, if I'm just going to be posting it online. And then there's like there's people have their different calculations, 85% brightness if I'm going to be printing. So you said you have your screen at full brightness when you edit?
Yeah, always. And that comes from my editing, retouching. We always edit it at full brightness for wedding photos, and I've printed countless and they've all come out fine. It's all about how you calibrate your monitor. So I use the Data Color Spider X, for example, and it tells you what brightness to put it in, and so you can do it brighter or lower, and it'll calibrate it for you. So, anyways, I use always at full brightness.
Okay. And we have a
Which might
question
be
from Judith
scary.
joining. No, no. I mean, look, I guess if it's calibrated, it's really just it's all relative, right? It's like
Yeah.
if you're not calibrated, if your calibration software is telling you to edit at full brightness, it's obviously adjusting based on running at full brightness.
Yeah.
Rather
And it
versus just
actually asks you. So it asks you where you want the brightness, or you can just choose the like recommended brightness. It's a whole nother thing that
it's
recommend looking into.
we'll add that. We're gonna have like
I
Jess's
know.
footnotes.
Homework list.
There we go. Question coming in from Judith asking if entering an art competition, is it legitimate to plug in a sky someone else created, or do you always need to use your own? Jess, do you have any experience with this? I know this is like we're throwing a tough one at you here. I
So
guess it depends on the competition.
yeah, I was going to say, first and foremost, it depends on the competition rules. Secondly, you didn't use that sky, so you have to be very, very, or you didn't create that sky, I mean, so you have to be very, very conscious of, like, did you purchase that sky? What are the rules that you had when purchasing that sky? Is it for commercial use? Is it for, so like that gets into a whole nother copyright issue.
Hmm.
For the most part, this is where, like, we could go on this discussion of rabbit holes forever, but so my line, you could have your own line. So for my line, photography, if I took both those photos and put them together, it's still photography for me. But if I'm buying stock art and putting things together, then to me it becomes digital art. So that's where you draw your line, and everyone's line is different or whatever they want to use. But first and foremost, copyright issues. Can you use that sky legally? Do you have permission to use it? Licenses, that sort of thing. And then really the competition. What do the competition rules say? Did you have to take every part of that image? Can you even submit composites in that? So just really depends on those kind of questions.
Definitely. And I always say you can't lose a competition if you don't enter in the first
Yeah.
round.
Yeah. Even if you
I
have a
never
great cloudy sky or a bluebird sky, you could still win with a bluebird sky. It doesn't have to be this magnificent sunset or sunrise. So
Yes, Judith, always pay attention to the rules. Competitions, there's every competition is bound by its own rules. And again, I think the overarching argument when it comes down to editing is like we talked about before. Some people like salty, some people like sweet, some people like savory and umami, and some people like half a container of salt, and some people like the little Salt Bay
yeah.
salt. So
Yeah,
it's
it's
like
really what your artistic vision is for the photo. I can appreciate the whole naturalist movement and the naturalist photo taking, no editing. I really appreciate that for the beauty it is. Me personally, that's not my style. I do composites. And so it's just what you like and what you want to come away with and what you had envisioned for your photo, I think.
exactly. Well, I will make this discernment, even though you're compositing, you're doing more editing than some people might do. It's beautifully done. It's tasteful. It doesn't look like the kids say now overbaked.
Overbaked.
Some overbaked edits. But it looks nice. It looks tasteful. It looks natural. And I think it's like you said in the beginning, you said you only get out, you might catch 10 sunrises or sunsets per year. And I think this resonates, that mentality resonates with a lot of people. It's like we have a
Yeah.
lot of people, especially our viewers, who work 9-to-5 jobs, work overnight jobs, are juggling kids, and photography is not a business for them, but it's a hobby. It's a release. It's art. It's all subjective. I know I'm ranting, but this is my show.
I completely agree with you.
So it's
Say
like,
you go to like some far off country and you get bluebird skies the whole time. Does that mean you're not going to edit any of them because they're all bluebird skies? And that's not my aesthetic. I'm like, no, I'm going to drop some skies in there.
Yeah,
That's just me personally.
No, it's beautiful work. And you do a great job of getting in camera. And I'm gonna end it on this question right here. It looks like you capture in camera. It's like what your editing mindset is. So to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it looks like you shoot a scene with the final product somewhat in mind. So when you need to, okay, I'm gonna shoot this a stop and a third under because of X, Y, and Z, or I'm gonna shoot this a little overexposed because, I just saw in your work that you knew where to carve your path. You knew what you were going to leave alone, what you were going to apply massaging techniques to. I call post-processing massaging.
Or shading the apple is another term that a lot of people use. Yeah. I think in field, getting it as much right in the camera as possible is going to streamline your workflow in the digital darkroom. But always, and this comes with practice and editing a lot, like I always shoot with the edit in mind so that when I go into the field, I say I need to do a focus stack. I'm going to make sure I get all those focus points, because if I don't have an image. Or if I need to do a focal length blend or something more complicated, I want to make sure I get all those pieces before I leave the scene and can't go back and get that same whatever atmosphere or light or whatever again. So really, really important to get it right in camera, even if you overshoot. Like, shoot as much as you want, and you can always delete them later if you don't need them. So if you're messing around with white balance, for example, you don't know what white balance to choose in the camera, you can go ahead and try it in this blue or white balance, try it in the more yellow white balance, try it in all different white balances, because again, as long as your memory card can hold all those photos, you just delete them at home if you don't need them. And then you can see them on a bigger screen besides the back of your camera. And that will get you a lot more comfortable with shooting for the edit. So next time you go out, you're like, oh, well, this shade white balance works in the desert, but it doesn't work in the mountains because it makes the snow look yellow. So, just learning those things through practice. So.
Definitely. Well, look, Jess, you made it easy. You took us through step by step. It's funny, we got some comments in. It's like, man, that's a lot of patience to go that long for edit. I'm like the same way. I'm like, I don't care if it doesn't look good. I don't feel like editing. But I learned some stuff. There's some stuff you did in your process that I'm like, oh, that would make it so much easier. So this is why we do it. It's like everybody has their own way. I think that's kind of like the gift and the curse of Photoshop and Lightroom. There's, Photoshop specifically, there's a million different ways to do each procedure. So it's like, it's great, but at the same time, it's like, depending on who you ask, they have a different way of doing it. So
yeah, and you can pick and choose. Like I love watching other people edit, because I'm like, oh, it's a technique that I could apply just straight from them, just in this one area, or it sparks an idea. Like using the overlay brush to get between those trees was actually sparked from my idea of cutting hair out, like of a background that I saw someone do. And I'm like, oh, I could use those for the trees. Then I don't have to go pixel by pixel, So it's just, sometimes you don't even use that same technique, but it sparks an idea for yourself and how you can do something better, quicker, more accurate, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, the overlay brush is something that I don't use, and same thing. That's exactly what I was referring to when I said, "Oh, that would."
There you go.
A lot. There you go. See, so I learned something. I hope everybody out there learned something. We will have Jess back next month, so mark your calendars. We're gonna get more tips, tricks, and maybe I'll learn a lot more next time. You're like the new Bob Ross. Happy little trees.
Happy little
on.
Trees. Happy little flowers in this case.
Exactly. Well, Jess, Always great having you. So thank you again for gracing us with your presence. A huge thank you to Sony for sponsoring today's event. So we'll get Jess back next time. Make sure you go shoot her a follow on Instagram at Miss Jess Bess. And Jess, what's the website?
OneLoveArt.co.
I knew I was going to mess it up. I'm like, the Instagram is easy. It's like, it's got a nice
It's
little
in
ring
my
to it.
bio on my Instagram, so you're all good. You
There
can go to the
Check your
Instagram and get there too.
There you go. Follow and click. Do it the right way. There you go. So
Thank you so much for having me.
Now it's our pleasure. Thanks again. We'll see you next month. To the rest of you, yeah, we're off tomorrow. We'll see you Monday. Have a good